Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. If you're on the East Coast, or good day to everyone in later time zones. The question we have before us today is really central and critical. The security laws that have grown up over the last 100 years took for granted the stability of the climate. With the climate changing, business and governments are struggling to find the right ways to measure and transmit the data that tells us what the climate is doing and how fast it's changing. The last 6 months have been particularly acute as COVID-19 have brought tragedies around the world, with it opportunity to test how well we can collect and transmit data about dramatic change. Our distinguished panel today will introduce everybody in turn. For starters, I'd like to reach out to Mark Lewis from BNP Paribas to talk a little bit about those long-term and short-term needs for data I just laid out. One, what has COVID-19 taught us about, in particular, something like oil demand, something so central to economic health? And B, how are you finding the general ESG and climate data conversations warming up?
Thanks, Eric, and great to be here this afternoon. Real pleasure to be part of this event. Well, on your first question regarding oil demand, I think some of us have been observing the structural pressures on the oil market for a long time now. And I think what COVID has done, quite clearly it seems, is to accelerate the force with which those structural pressures bring themselves to bear. If you think about some of the key industries that have been badly affected by COVID, the aviation industry is probably the one that suffered the most. Aviation demand for oil, for fuel, has grown at 2.5 times the rate of oil demand generally over the last 50 years. Oil demand over the last 50 years has grown at an average of 1.5% per year, and aviation fuel demand has grown at 4% per year. So the fact that aviation has taken such a big hit to COVID is really a major problem for the oil industry, because that's been one of the biggest drivers of the growth. And guess what? Markets drive valuations on the basis of growth. It's the growth in demand for a product or for a commodity that really drives the market's valuation of that product or commodity, whether we're talking about a share price and equities or a commodity such as oil. So this is, I think, a major moment, an awakening for investors that actually we may be seeing, indeed, the peak in global oil demand. Just today, I mean, to show you how topical this is, just today we've got BP giving its major strategic update on how it intends to change its business model and move to a more renewables-focused business model. And you've got OPEC giving a pretty gloomy picture on the state of the oil market and expecting oil demand this year. We're looking at a contraction in oil demand this year of over 8 million barrels today. The largest previous contraction in global oil demand we've ever seen is 2.6 million barrels a day in 1980 at the time of the Iranian the Iranian Revolution. So this is by a long, long way the most dramatic contraction in oil demand, and I think it will accelerate the energy transition. On your second question, Eric, we are seeing a huge interest in sustainability issues more generally. That was present again before COVID came along, but I think COVID has concentrated investors' minds on this. We all know that inflows into ESG funds and the performance of ESG funds has been very striking since the crisis hit. And what that does in turn is to raise the importance and the profile of data as well. But I'll finish this introductory remark with one, I think, very important observation. Data is hugely important. We need more of it. We need it to be targeted. But we don't necessarily always need data to reach the right conclusions. It was clear, coming back to your first question, that oil demand at some point was going to suffer as a result of the structural pressures that have been out there for a long time. Decarbonization, the deflation of renewables, the need for cleaner air in the world's biggest cities. COVID has brought those into focus, but if you were paying attention, that really big point about the structural change should have given you a very clear steer beforehand about how you should have been adjusting your portfolio.
Mark, thank you very much for that. And the panel we have assembled this morning really gives us an opportunity to see a kind of supply chain of data that includes everything from the downstream end, the user experience that investors and governments and businesses will take on. But it also means satellites and ways of understanding the data being sent from satellites. And for more on that, we'll go to Carlo Buontemp, who's director of the Copernicus Climate Change Service in the EU.
Good morning. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Oh, right. Sorry about that. I just left you hanging there for a second. My first question to you is, let's stay on COVID for a second and tell us a little bit about some of the most striking things we've learned about how we can capture mass changes in human behavior from space and remote or other ground-based measurement systems. And what does that mean for climate change data generation going forward?
Yes. Thank you for the question. And I wasn't quite sure whether to start straight away from where the previous speaker left, because indeed there is an issue of data. And I think the COVID crisis shown very clearly the importance of data and the importance of open data and open science in dealing with some of this pandemic. So I guess one of the things we learned from the exercise is the importance of having scientists at reach, having experts there who can guide our actions. There is also something we learned about the climate, and it's quite exciting in many respects, especially from a scientific point of view. So I guess many of us have seen these spectacular images taken by the Sentinel-5P satellite of the Copernicus program, showing a decline in a lot of pollutants, especially in urban areas. So during the lockdown in Europe, in China, there was a decline in particulate matter, there was a decline in NO2, in the nitrous oxide, and so on. And this, I think, is there as an expression of what we can achieve in relatively little time. But there is also a complexity there, and that's why I think talking about data and talking about science becomes very important, is that in this decline that has been so spectacular and so much picked up by different media, there are several components. There is a reduction in the emission themselves, and I'm talking about the emissions of the nitrous oxide and the particulate matter, but there is also a change in meteorology, a change in circulation. And if we want our action to be guided by good advice, good science, then we need to be able to distinguish between the two. Now, I was talking about specific species of trace gases and particulate matter in cities. And if we take this as a metaphor of what can be done on the climate, then the things become much more complicated. If we look at the global emission of greenhouse gases, there's been a decline, the biggest decline in emissions since the end of the Second World War. Nevertheless, the concentration of greenhouse gases have kept going up. So there is a bit of a nudge in the emission this year, from 2.8 part per million to probably something around 2.4 part per million, as seen in the Manual Law time series. But it is small; it's still an increase. So if we want to do a parallel with the COVID, it's like looking at the emission as a bit of a reproductive number. You know, now we are all familiar with exponential and reproductive number, and we know that if the reproductive number is above 1, it means that the pandemic is in an expansion. In a sense, to simplify a much more complex landscape, I would say that as long as the emissions are positive, the concentration can only go up. I mean, it's not that simple, but to simplify it. And we are very far from zero emission. So there is a lot that we need to do if we want to reach those challenging targets that we have ahead. There is also, you asked also a question about the technology, what is missing, what is required. And I think there are two lines to take there. On the one hand, the COVID crisis has shown that we don't yet have a good grasp on the emissions. So the emissions are not necessarily well available from satellite or from the technology we have now at a sufficient spatial and temporal resolution to take action. The other side of the story is that actually there is a lot of information available about the climate system that will help to manage risk and harvest opportunity, and we are not yet taking. So there was a reference before about this transition towards renewable. Increasing the renewable fraction of the energy mix means also increasing the volatility of the energy market and making more challenging the balancing of networks. And for this, we need more information, more data about the climate around us to manage those risks and harvest these opportunities.
Thanks, Carlo. Let's move on to Rebecca Moore, Director of Google Earth. Rebecca, you sit at the center of, well, everything, I guess. Google Earth's platforms take in scientific and other kinds of data, put them in an understandable interface, and then send it out to the world of communities who need it. What are the lessons you've learned from the COVID data collection, and what are the implications of that for your larger climate work?
Thanks, Eric, and greetings from San Francisco Bay Area, where we are enjoying record wildfires, unprecedented. We almost get tired of saying that word unprecedented because things continue onward. It's a pleasure to follow Carlo and the discussion about the Copernicus program, because I think they have one of the finest Earth observing constellations of satellites that is collecting very, very relevant data for COVID-19, environmental understanding, climate action, and so on. On our side, what we're hearing when we talk with communities, scientists, governments, decision makers, NGOs, academics, they say, we're drowning in data. We're thirsty for insights. There's such a wealth of fantastic raw data being collected now, public data, private data, users collecting data using purple air sensors, and it can be petabytes of data coming in. And the question is, how do you turn that into actionable insights? How do you turn those pixels into knowledge? And so, we have people know Google Earth and Google Maps, which allow people to see and visualize imagery of the planet and navigate from point A to point B. But we also developed the Google Earth Engine platform that allows doing petapixel scale science and turning all that incredible treasure trove of raw data into knowledge, such as, for example, the air quality work. I think one of the things we're seeing is, first of all, well, we have discovered that cities are the center of action, can be the center of action for climate change. 70% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from cities. More than 10,000 cities have taken a pledge through the Global Covenant of Mayors to reduce their carbon emissions. And yet only 20% of them have been able to take even the first step of creating a baseline inventory, much less a climate action plan. And it's because they are missing that actionable data on their transport emissions, on their solar energy potential, on their building emissions. It's very costly and challenging for them to try to measure their own emissions. So one of the things that we found is the same data that we have that powers Google Maps and Google Earth, that provides that 3D photorealistic cityscape, can be turned into knowledge about, for example, the solar energy potential of hundreds of millions of buildings, or the transportation data we have that allows you to give traffic insights to people, can be turned into carbon emission information for cities. So we've packaged that up. We have actually built pipelines that are providing that information now to cities. I'm happy to announce today that we're scaling from 122 cities that we gave this data to last year to today, now 3,000 cities we're providing this information. And we have a big announcement this morning, if you check the news, about our next level ambition on helping with climate action. And in this case, we're pledging today that we're going to help over 500 cities reduce a gigaton of carbon emissions by 2030. And that should hopefully be a significant chunk in city-related carbon emissions.
That's extraordinary news and great to hear. Thank you for sharing that with us. Let's return to that in a couple of minutes after everybody's had a chance to speak. Next, we'll go to Niels Peulicke-Andersen, who's head of ESG Accounting at Ørsted. Niels, can you tell us a little bit about how Ørsted has come to use data, both what you intake about the weather and wind systems that you take advantage of just in generation, and then also the data that you produce as a company and how you share it to the audiences of yours that need to see it?
Yes, Ørsted is an energy company, and we are the world's biggest developer of offshore wind, and wind is the fuel for offshore wind farms. So we follow wind data very closely, and we actually include them in our reporting. Each month we get wind data from across the world and we have mapped them against our wind farms, and then we can calculate the average wind speed for our wind portfolio against a normal wind year, and that says something about what the generation can be expected from the wind farms. And of course, wind farm generation generates revenue and value for the company and power for everyone. So that's one of the ways we use these wind data. Data in general has played a key role in the green transformation of Ørsted as a company. You know, we have transformed from a very fossil-heavy company about more than a decade ago and into one of the most green companies in the world. And we have set very ambitious energy targets or greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for the company. And data has played a very important role in order to analyze where to put the effort into reducing the emissions around in the company. From the beginning, we focused mainly on the big power stations, but the recent update of our targets actually includes all greenhouse gas emissions from across the company. And they are currently aligned with the 1.5 degree reduction scenario and are science-based approved as such.
Thank you for that. Now that everybody's acquainted, let's go back. Rebecca, is there any more detail you'd like to share about this announcement, just since it's happening in real time? What else are some of the key highlights that we should know going forward? Sure,
thanks, Eric. So a little deeper on this work with cities. This is accessible through our Environmental Insights Explorer, so people can find that online. We first piloted these insights for cities around their transport emissions, their building emissions, and their solar energy potential with 5 cities in 2018. And then, as I said, about 100 cities last year. And we learned through that process that this can help them accelerate their ambition. It can help them amplify their ambition because they now have the data to tell them the art of the possible, what's actually possible to achieve. For example, the city of San Jose learned that they had sufficient solar energy potential to generate more than 1 gigawatt of rooftop solar from their city. They created incentives for that. Houston, the oil and gas capital of the world, based on the insights that we've given them through the Environmental Insights Explorer, just announced a 5 megawatt target for themselves. And they want to, this will create more than 1,000 green jobs. So there is this really wonderful connection between improving, mitigating climate change and being part of a green recovery. There is a blog post where people can learn more about this, but it's just been exciting to see the traction that we're getting when cities have the detailed knowledge to understand their baseline, set plans, and take action. We also announced that we have completely we announced that we were carbon neutral in 2007, but now we've completely addressed our carbon legacy, going all the way back to the founding of the company. And we've announced that by 2030, we are going to be 24/7 completely carbon-free energy powering our data centers and our campuses. So we are taking very, very aggressive action in our own operations as well as helping partners.
This is great news. All carbon cutting news is great news, but to hear it from such an influential and central company will certainly have knock-on effects. And I'm curious what you think they are, Mark. What are your thoughts when Google makes an announcement like that, when it begins an initiative to help cities figure out where they are in their climate journeys? What are the knock-on effects of that in finance?
Well, I think one obvious example, and again, this has been very much to the fore as we've struggled with the COVID pandemic, has been the remarkable spectacle that we saw, particularly in some of the large mega cities of the developing world. New Delhi is the image that springs to my mind, where we had images of New Delhi before the lockdown and images of New Delhi during the lockdown. And obviously you see this huge difference between a city that is shrouded in pollution and shrouded in smog, and where the air quality is incredibly poor and it's having a very deleterious effect on the health of the citizens. And then the pictures of New Delhi, blue skies, presumably clean air to breathe. You can't see that in the pictures. But the serious issue is, I think, for policymakers and also for investors such as ourselves, is that is bound to have an impact on the way that the citizens of these very large megacities, where increasingly people are living, and as Rebecca said, cities are such a key focus of human life in the 21st century, and hence really the key to dealing with the climate change problem, if you think where demand for energy comes from. And if we can just get better data on the pollution that is happening in big cities in real time during the day, it allows city planners to make transportation and energy consumption more efficient. And it means for us as investors, we have to think carefully about the implications for traditional providers of energy sources, because inevitably, as you move to a cleaner way of generating and consuming energy, and in these big cities, a lot of it is to do with transport and very inefficient internal combustion engines that are going through cities and leaving trails of pollution behind them. If you can tax that more efficiently, it's going to have an impact on the profitability of the world's auto manufacturing companies. And this, of course, is why so many auto companies now are betting on an electric future. And it's why countries like China and India are saying we need to have a smart plan about the electrification of transport in our big cities. And I think where Google and other big data providers can help all of us, whether it be policymakers or investors such as ourselves, is just having that much better granular data to figure out who are going to be the winners and losers. You know, markets operate on the basis of information. That was the key insight between Mark Carney's impetus in setting up the TCFD 4 years ago and declaration of interest. I've been a member of the TCFD for the last 4 years, so you would expect me to be very keen on the idea of providing better, more granular data to markets and investors. And but I think, as I said at the beginning, it goes hand in hand with also having an intuitive understanding of how these big forces are shaping the world. You need to complement the granularity of data, which is very, very important, with a smarter understanding of what it all means. And at the end of the day, that's what we as investors are paid for by our clients. It's our job to interpret what that data means. So the data is one thing. It's really what Rebecca said earlier. We are all drowning in data, and we're thirsty for insight. And it's really how you combine those two features, because there's more data available than ever, and some of it is exceptionally useful. And I would say, one of the pieces of data coming out of COVID is this point about pollution in big cities and how we can deal with that problem.
Niels, I'm sorry, Carlo, do you want to jump in? Carlo, you may be muted.
I am, sorry.
Okay.
I was keen to jump in, yes, because there is a point I think is quite interesting from what Rebecca was saying, which highlight the importance of data, also not just for emissions, but in general, to look at the mitigation side, so the efficiency of energy and so on. So going then on to what Mark was saying about TCFD and the role that data has, for instance, on health. We're talking about New Delhi and the air quality in New Delhi and the need of a constant stream of data there. But it's also true for energy. If you want to assess the cash flow or the return on investment of a wind farm, you need to have reliable data. You need to be prepared for the next wind drought that we were not aware when the first happened. It's true for agriculture. If you want to understand what is the risk you're facing for a drought hitting at the same time all the producing center of soybeans, for instance, is something we didn't know until very recently. All this data is required, but in order to harvest this data and get this insight that Mark was referring to, I think there is the need for an investment on the data layer, ensuring that this data is open, is interoperable, that it is provided with standards of quality, that is trustworthy, that its provenance can be guaranteed, and so on. And this is the less fancy part of the job, but is a part that is very fundamental and needs to be taken care of. So that's where I see a part of our role, if you want, and it's not just us. Many other institutions are doing the same. But in order for the Google and the Amazon and the many other companies of this world to build upon that, there is a need for a fundamental work on data. And this is becoming more and more important now than the data on the environment and on the climate is permeating all these work of life.
I like what you said about the less fancy part of the job. Building a clean economy will have a lot of less fancy parts. Not everybody sits atop the platform that Rebecca does. Niels, question for you about, I'm just curious how you, maybe just a little bit about your internal monologue about when you hear of a major initiative that has no direct bearing on people signing contracts for offshore wind, but nonetheless moves a lot of figures toward the direction for higher demand for clean energy. And at what point do distributed improvements in knowledge and measurement become something that concretely means more business for your company?
Well, we follow the demand and all the projections about energy demand into the future very closely and adjust the strategy accordingly. We actually we have set a target of the build out of our installed renewable energy target for 2030 is actually 30 gigawatt, which corresponds to about we can supply power to more than 50 people, green electricity to more than 50 million people. Well, my part is mainly to make sure that the data that is provided for our executive committee and board of directors and for investors is that they have all of these data regarding our capacity generation, data about how the wind farms are operating, that they have trustworthy data available. And that's what we do from the department that I run.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Thank you. A question, many of us are in Europe or North America, but the vast majority of people who will benefit from the growth of a clean energy economy are in the global South. And how do communities there prioritize the development of data tools and products when it's a heavy enough lift in nations with sophisticated government satellite programs going back 50 years? What do people do in parts of the world where that's a much heavier lift for local governments and citizens?
Well, I think if I may jump in.
Go ahead, Carlo, please.
So, yeah, it's Mark here. I was just going to make one observation on that, which is clearly the development of the global energy system over the last 200 years, based as it was on fossil fuels, has been exceedingly capital intensive and very centralized. And one of the advantages of renewable energy, I mean, I think there are two key differentiating factors of renewable energy, particularly solar energy, as compared with fossil fuel energy, that really are very well suited to developing countries. That's the good news. Again, the big data can be used places to install and ensure that it's being consumed at the most efficient time in the most efficient ways. But the two differentiating factors I wanted to emphasize are, number one, renewable energy has this inherently deflationary aspect to it. If you look at the experience of Europe with renewable energy in the last 10 years, it's been an incredibly exciting time, because the cost of renewable energy has fallen spectacularly, much more quickly than anybody would have thought possible. And that deflationary development will continue. And it's countries in the developing world who weren't as developed in terms of their energy systems that will benefit from that, because it will be cheaper for them to catch up. So there's an element of leapfrogging and catching up, in the same way that we've seen Africa move with mobile telephony and leapfrog fixed telephony. So I think that there's an element there where it can actually be an advantage for developing countries in not incurring all of this infrastructure, that some of which will undoubtedly be stranded in the developed world. And so I think that's a very important point, this deflationary aspect. The other point, of course, is the decentralized aspect, particularly of solar. So in contrast to the oil and gas industry, coal industry, and certainly the nuclear industry, if you think about power generation, which solar in the developed world is competing with directly now, they're all very capital intensive industries, and they require centralized distribution systems. The great thing about solar is you can put it on your rooftop and you can monitor your own consumption and your own production. And in particular, for some of the poorest countries in the world, that's a tremendous advantage. So in African villages, you can use solar to displace kerosene, which again is not only much more expensive than solar nowadays, but is environmentally pollutive. So I think it's a question of bringing the information into the right places and planning this as efficiently as possible, and that's where the data comes in. But I think there are actually some grounds for being very optimistic about how the energy transition can play out in the developing world in general, and in some of the poorest countries in the world in particular.
Rebecca or Carlo, did one of you have follow-up comments?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I'm really happy it was asked. I think it's, we're interested as Google in democratizing access to all this kind of technology and data so that people can be empowered. The people, local, authorities, local communities who have much better understanding of the issues than so-called experts who may be thousands of miles away. How can we empower them? And in fact, when you look at the inception of the Google Earth Engine environmental monitoring platform, it came at a meeting we attended in Brazil at the Coalition of Rainforest Nations in 2009, who were struggling with the challenge and the opportunity to monitor their forests, right? forest deforestation is also a very strong contributor to climate change. And there are, great opportunities with so-called nature-based solutions. And countries were being asked to monitor their forests. And at this meeting, they said, our computers are 12 years old. We have constant power outages in our capital cities. How are we supposed to be, doing this with the capabilities that we have? And this is where I think the power of cloud computing can really help, right? So that if these countries have just enough bandwidth to get in a web browser, they can now access different cloud computing platforms, including Earth Engine and others, which provide all the data to them that's coming in hourly. It provides thousands of computers for computation in the cloud. It provides the latest scientific algorithms running on that data in the cloud, and they are empowered to turn those pixels into knowledge, as I like to say. So we've been doing trainings all over the world, a lot in the global south, and we're Brazil, India, working with NASA, Servier in Southeast Asia. We're seeing a huge uptake. So I think you have to do the hard work of capacity development and listening and building the right capabilities. But I think there's really an opportunity now for developing world to almost leapfrog the developed world, just as mobile phones, they leapfrogged landlines. I think many of these countries are not stuck with legacy desktop systems. So they're going right to the cloud, and they are in some ways, innovating.
I want to, Mark, do you have something to add to that?
No, I think that's, we're in violent agreement there, Rebecca and myself.
Okay,
Great,
I want to.
I can just jump in to
Please, Carlo,
reinforce the violent agreement that already exists, because I was going to say, when Rebecca started talking, basically the same thing, that that's the future. Just to add one simple fact, is the fact that this is true. So that the need of using cloud computing to manipulate this huge data set that are coming from satellite, coming from our computer model and the like, is becoming a priority also in the developed world. And in that sense, this really makes sense of that concept of the leapfrog, because it's not just the global south that face that challenge, it's us. If you want to take just a couple of parameters from our global model for a year, that's 200 gigabytes. That's more than the disk space on my laptop. So I cannot produce reasonably a plot with that. I need a cloud infrastructure that is close enough to the data so I can do the manipulation of the data there and generate the output I want. And so this is happening everywhere, and there is really an opportunity for the global south to leapfrog and take that technology and reduce the gap.
I want to, before Niels, I ask you to weigh in on the previous question, just to, with 9 or 8 minutes left, just to get everybody else thinking about the sort of the practical takeaways for companies about all this. Particularly looking at what we've learned from the past 6 months and how we've learned it, what should companies be thinking about new kinds of data products they'll need and where to get them? But before, I also wanted to give Niels an opportunity to respond to questions about countries in the global south that have a great need for energy, but not the resources of the OECD nations.
I'm sorry, can you elaborate the question?
Well, I think the question was just generally how do we make sure that as we develop new methods for producing data and ways to distribute them widely, how do we make sure that the global south is not left out of the conversation? And
I'm sorry.
For you,
yeah.
I mean, for you, I think, frankly, the question is just how do we get offshore renewable power everywhere? How do we make sure that it's built in a manner that's equitable and brings electrons where they're most needed?
I'm sorry, it's out of scope. I have no input on that. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay. Apologies for that. But so maybe let's just go on to, in our last few minutes, to the practical implications of what you've seen in the last 6 months. We were presented through tragedy with an opportunity to learn a lot of new things. What are those things, and how can companies make them useful and turn them into stable data projects in the years ahead? Any?
Well, I could maybe, yeah, I could offer a comment on that, Eric. I think one thing we are likely to see this year is, and again, it's a trend that's been visible for some time. But if you talk about environmental impact data, I'm going to focus here on renewable energy. One trend that has been very clear for some time is that renewable energy has been growing much more quickly than any other source of energy, right? But the importance of that has been underappreciated. It comes back to the point I made in my introductory remarks, namely that what drives financial markets and what investors are interested in is the rate of growth in demand, not the system level of demand. Okay, so what does that mean in practice? Let's take a piece of data from last year and let's imagine how it's going to look this year. Last year, 2019, according to BP data, renewable energy, by which I mean here very narrowly wind and solar, accounted for only 4% of global primary energy demand, but they accounted for 34% of the increase in global primary energy demand, right? And if you look at the numbers for electricity, in 2019, wind and solar accounted for only 8% of global electricity demand, but 86% of the increase in global electricity demand. Now, how do we think those numbers are going to look this year when you've had COVID impacting the oil industry, fossil fuels in general? But according to the International Energy Agency, wind and solar will yet again show an increase. I think you can credibly argue, and I'm very excited about whether this will be the case, but I would expect to see renewable energy accounting for 100% or more of the increase in electricity demand this year, which means potentially that the global demand for fossil fuels for electricity will have peaked. That has tremendous consequences. It's already happened in Europe some time ago, but if that's happened on a global level, that has tremendous consequences for investors. And I would imagine, I wouldn't be surprised to see wind and solar account for 50% or more of the global increase in primary energy demand overall. So this is an incredibly exciting business, not as usual development. And I think it should lead all of us who are interested in the future of energy and the future of the environment, which should be all of us, whatever our walk of life professionally on a daily basis, think through the consequences of that. It means there's going to be a big value redistribution of value between fossil fuels and renewable energy going forward, and it should be a push to policymakers to accelerate, however and wherever they can, the speed of this energy transition, because we've now reached a point where renewables are economically competitive under their own steam with fossil fuels. So anything policymakers can do to relieve bottlenecks and improve the speed of deployment is really what we should be taking away from this business not as usual condition. It provides us with a tremendously exciting opportunity.
Thank you for that, Mark. In our last few minutes, maybe let's just do a speed round on the practical takeaways for our viewers. Niels, I want to maybe start with you. And what are just some some of the best practical lessons from your work integrating ESG and financial data, things that you've learned that can be of use for companies not quite as advanced as yours going forward?
Yes, as head of ESG Accounting, I can only emphasize that we moved the responsibility of the ESG reporting into the financial organization some 5 years ago, and we have had a lot of success from that. We actually consolidate the financial data and the ESG data in the same system. So as we report on all of these things, for example, the green revenue, that is a number that is being asked for, and the EU has also an initiative about green taxonomy, where you can disclose the green revenue. Now that we run the ESG reporting from the financial organization, we can much faster combine the financial data with the ESG data and create such values. We also, and I can only also emphasize to build on international standards as we do, and be very transparent about the accounting policies behind your data, because you need trust in your data. So be very open about how you calculate the data from the company, what is included, what is the scoping of the data. So in our reports, you will find both the data, and you will also find a very clear description of how they are collected and calculated and prepared. And of course, also have them verified by a third party as well.
Okay.
I can recommend that.
Thank you very much for that. And unfortunately, I feel like we've run down the clock with everyone's super important, super interesting contributions. I want to thank everybody for your time. Rebecca, thank you for getting up early, and we hope that the terrible fires that are plaguing the West clear up soon, and you get your air back. Thank you, everyone.